The bucket rose from the well not with water but with iron. Shackles, dripping with rust and seawater, hung where a man should be. The night before, Isaiah Green was seen right here hauling water for the master's house. This morning, he was gone. The master, in a rage, ordered the well drained, certain he'd find a body. But at the bottom there was no man, no bones, only the impossible, the faint, unmistakable smell of salt, as though the deep, dark water had somehow met the sea. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The air in the forge was a physical weight, a suffocating blanket woven from coal smoke, the sharp tang of hot metal and the salt of human sweat. It was a place of perpetual twilight, where the only sun was the roaring, hungry heart of the fire, a beast that Isaiah Green fed and tamed every day of his life. In 1836, on the Fairchild plantation just outside Charleston, this forge was Isaiah's world. He stood before the anvil, his body a silhouette against the pulsing orange glow, muscles coiling and uncoiling across his back and arms with a rhythm that had become as natural as breathing. He was shoeing a nervous mare, his movements a study in controlled power. His low voice a soothing rumble that calmed the animal more effectively than any twitch or bridle. The rhythmic clang of his hammer on steel was the plantation's defiant heartbeat, a sound of creation in a place dedicated to subjugation. Each strike was precise, shaping the glowing metal not with brute force but with an intimate knowledge of its nature, knowing just when to strike, when to cool, when to bend. Master Fairchild appeared in the wide doorway, a pale, soft figure who seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. His linen shirt was immaculate. His hands, clasped behind his back, were smooth and unblemished. Only his eyes were hard, carrying the cold, assessing glint of a man who measures the world in assets and liabilities. He watched Isaiah for a long moment, his presence sucking the already thin air from the forge. Isaiah did not need to look to know he was there. He could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the way the dust motes seemed to still, the way the very shadows deepened. He continued his work, his focus absolute, the hammer falling in its steady, unbroken cadence. "That's good Pennsylvania iron, Isaiah," Fairchild said, his voice smooth and uninflected. He gestured with his chin toward the rack of raw materials. "See you don't waste it. Every piece of it costs me." Isaiah placed the horseshoe into the quenching bucket, where it hissed and steamed, surrendering its heat with a sigh. He straightened his back, the muscles cording along his spine, and turned to face the man who owned him. He kept his gaze respectful, fixed on a point just past Fairchild's shoulder. "Yes, master. I make it strong. It will last." The words were deferential, the tone obedient, but in the private space behind his eyes they held a different meaning. He made things strong. He himself was strong. He would last. It was a promise he made to himself with every swing of the hammer, a truth he forged in the fire alongside the iron. Fairchild saw a tool, a valuable piece of property that could turn his expensive iron into functional objects. Isaiah saw a man, a creator whose worth was not marked on any ledger. He was keenly, painfully aware of his own value, a value that Fairchild could exploit but never truly comprehend. The master's gaze lingered, a cold wait before he grunted, satisfied with the performance of obedience, and moved on, his shadow receding from the doorway. Isaiah watched him go, the tension in his shoulders easing almost imperceptibly. He picked up the cooled shoe, its dark, solid curve resting in his palm, a small, perfect thing he had made with his own hands, and turned back to the waiting horse. The walk from the forge to the quarters was a journey between worlds. He left the heat and clamor behind, stepping into the thick, humid air of the low-country evening. The sun was bleeding through the cypress trees, painting the sky in bruised shades of orange and purple. Field hands moved slowly, their bodies stooped with the day's labor, their faces masks of exhaustion. Isaiah walked among them, his own fatigue a different sort, a weariness of the soul rather than the body. He carried the heat of the fire within him, a banked ember of resentment that never fully cooled. His cabin was small, the wood weathered to a soft gray, but a magnificent magnolia tree stood sentinel beside it, its waxy leaves a deep, glossy green. The air inside was different, filled with the scent of corn pone baking on the hearth, and the faint, sweet perfume of the magnolia blossoms that Ilara always kept in a jar of water. She was sitting on their small stool, her back to the door, mending one of his shirts. The needle moved with a quiet grace in her slender fingers. She was the center of his world, the calm eye in the storm of his life. She looked up as he entered, a soft smile touching her lips. "You carry the heat of that fire in you long after the sun goes down," she said, her voice a gentle melody. She rose and came to him, placing a cool hand on his forearm, feeling the tension that radiated from him like waves from hot iron. Isaiah's gaze softened as he looked at her, the hard mask he wore for the world dissolving in the safety of her presence. "It's not the fire, Ilara," he said, his voice low. "It's the waiting." They ate their simple meal in the growing twilight, the silence between them comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. They had a language that required few words, a conversation carried on in glances, in the touch of a hand, in the shared rhythm of their breathing. After they ate, he sat on the floor, his back against the wall, and she sat before him, leaning against his chest as he carefully worked the tangles from her long hair with a wooden comb. "The North Star was bright tonight," he murmured into her hair, his lips close to her ear. It was their code, their whispered prayer. The North Star was a constant, a fixed point in a shifting, treacherous world. It was the promise of a direction, the geography of a dream. "It's always there," she whispered back, her eyes closing, "even when you can't see it." Her hand rested on her lower belly, a small, almost unconscious gesture. They had not spoken of it aloud, not yet. It was a secret too precious, too dangerous to be given voice. A new life, a new spirit was growing within her. The knowledge was a source of profound joy, a light so bright it was terrifying. A pregnant woman was more valuable, her future and the future of her child already calculated on a ledger. Her vulnerability, and therefore his, had increased tenfold. The stakes of his yearning for freedom, once a personal burning ache, had become exponential, a desperate imperative for the future of his family. They had heard whispers of a family sold from a neighboring plantation just last week, torn apart on the auction block in Charleston. The husband sent to the sugar fields of Louisiana, the wife and children to a cotton farm in Georgia. The fear was a constant, unwelcome guest in their lives, a shadow that lurked even in this small, love-filled cabin. Ilara's pregnancy gave that shadow a new and terrible substance. His final chore of the day was to haul water for the great house. The community well stood behind the slave quarters, a squat cylinder of dark, moss-covered brick that seemed as ancient as the live oaks that surrounded it. The work was grueling, the heavy wooden bucket descending into the blackness on a groaning rope, then returning laden with cold, heavy water that sloshed over the sides, soaking his hands and feet. Tonight, Old Man Cato was sitting on a nearby log, his gnarled hands busy with a piece of wood, a knife moving with slow, deliberate strokes. Cato was an elder, a man whose eyes seemed to hold the memory of Africa, a man who spoke in riddles and saw things others missed. He watched Isaiah work the winch, his head tilted. "That well is deep," Cato said, his voice a low rumble like stones shifting at the bottom of a river. "Deeper than any man knows. My granddaddy told me it drinks from the earth, and the earth drinks from the sea." Isaiah paused, his arms aching from the strain. He wiped a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, leaving a smudge of soot. He had always felt something strange about this well. On certain nights when the air was heavy and the moon was full, he could have sworn the water carried a faint, briny taste, a whisper of salt that made no sense so many miles from the harbor. "The sea?" he asked, his curiosity piqued. "But the sea is miles from here." Cato didn't look up from his carving. A slow smile creased his weathered face. "The water remembers the way," he said cryptically. "All water is one water." He finished his work, blowing away the small shavings to reveal a small, smooth, carved bird. He held it out to Isaiah. Then he reached into a pouch at his belt and produced a single, perfectly smooth, dark stone. "For your Elara," he said, pressing the stone into Isaiah's hand, "for the new spirit coming." Isaiah's heart gave a jolt. Cato knew. Of course he knew. The old man saw everything. He closed his hand around the stone, its coolness a stark contrast to the humid night air. He looked from the stone to Cato, then to the dark, gaping mouth of the well. The weight of the water bucket he had just hauled felt different now, heavier, imbued with a significance he couldn't yet grasp. It felt like the weight of his bondage, the endless, repetitive labor of his life. But Cato's words, strange and mystical, offered something else, a glimmer of impossible hope, a path he had never imagined, a door where he had only ever seen a wall of dark, wet brick. He felt a jolt of fear and wonder, a sense that the world was far larger and far more mysterious than he had ever been allowed to believe. The old man's words planted a seed in the fertile ground of his desperation, a seed that began to sprout into a wild, unbelievable idea. All water is one water. He looked down into the blackness of the well, and for the first time he did not see an end, but a beginning. That night the cabin was a pocket of darkness sealed against the world. Elara slept, her breathing a soft, steady rhythm in the quiet, but sleep was a country Isaiah could not enter. Cato's words had unlocked a door in his mind, and now a torrent of thoughts rushed through. All water is one water. The phrase echoed, turning over and over, less a riddle and more a statement of profound, hidden fact. He rose from their pallet, moving with the silence of a shadow, and found the plank of wood he had hidden beneath a loose floorboard. With a piece of charcoal saved from the forge, he began to draw. He was not a man of letters, for reading and writing were crimes that could cost him his hands or his life. But he was a master of patterns. The rhythms of the forge, the seasons of the year, the grain in a piece of wood. He understood these things on a level deeper than words. He knelt on the rough floor, the only light a sliver of moon through a crack in the wall, and began to make his marks. He drew the moon, a perfect circle for full, a crescent for its waxing and waning. Beside it he made other marks, a system of his own invention. He thought back, forcing his memory to walk through the past weeks and months. He recalled the nights he had hauled the water and noticed the strange, faint brininess. He tried to connect those nights to the shape of the moon in the sky. He remembered trips to the Charleston market, rare occasions when Fairchild needed supplies fetched from the city. He remembered the smell of the harbor, a thick, damp perfume of salt and fish and wet ropes. A smell of distance, of elsewhere. He tried to find a rhythm, a secret conversation between the distant, vast ocean and the deep, dark well. His chart grew, a complex tapestry of circles, lines, and crosses. It was a dangerous document, a map of a forbidden science. Each night became a ritual. After his last chore, he would bring a dipper of the well water back to the cabin. While Elara slept, he would perform a secret communion, taking a small sip, letting the water rest on his tongue. He was not just tasting for salt, he was tasting for change, for temperature, for a subtle shift in its character that he could only feel. Some nights it was flat, earthy, tasting of mud and moss. On other nights, a distinct sharp minerality bloomed in his mouth, the ghost of salt. He would mark his plank, his heart thudding with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. He was not merely hoping for a miracle, he was studying its mechanics. In the suffocating darkness of his cabin, surrounded by the brutal certainty of his bondage, Isaiah Green was becoming both a scientist and a mystic, a student of tides no one else knew existed. The world outside the cabin, however, had no patience for secret studies. The plantation operated on a rhythm of fear, and its conductor was the overseer, a man named Blevins. Blevins was a man carved from malice, with a cruel, thin mouth and pale, watchful eyes that missed nothing. He had noticed a change in the blacksmith, a distraction, a new depth in the man's gaze that he couldn't quite decipher, but which his predatory instincts registered as a deviation from the norm. He began to watch Isaiah, his presence a constant, unnerving shadow at the edge of Isaiah's vision. One sweltering afternoon, Blevins appeared at the forge, moving with a quietness that was more menacing than a shout. Isaiah was repairing a set of shackles, the heavy iron cuffs and chains that were a constant part of his work, a grim reminder of the tools of his own oppression. "Fairchild pays for a full day's work, not a full day's dreaming, boy," Blevins said, his voice a low sneer. He picked up the hammer, testing its weight, his eyes never leaving Isaiah. Isaiah didn't flinch. He continued his work, his movements economical and precise. "Just finishing this link, Mr. Blevins." Blevins leaned closer, inspecting the shackle Isaiah was mending. He ran a thumb over the new rivet, his touch lingering on the cold iron. "You seem to know your way around these right well," he said, the insinuation thick and ugly. It was a test, a provocation designed to elicit a flicker of fear, a flash of anger, any emotional response he could seize upon and punish. Isaiah's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. He could feel the overseer's cold gaze on him, a physical weight. But years of practice had taught him how to build a forge inside himself, to burn his emotions down to a hard, impassive core. He kept his face a mask of placid obedience, his eyes focused on the task at hand. "Just doing the work, Mr. Blevins," he repeated, his voice flat and even. Inside, he was a storm of fury and fear. Blevins was a predator, circling, sensing a change in the herd, and Isaiah knew that one wrong move, one flicker of defiance in his eyes could bring the man's whip down upon him. Blevins stared for another long, tense moment, then finding no crack in the mask, he grunted in frustration and stalked away. Isaiah let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding, the muscles in his shoulders screaming with tension. The encounter left him shaken, a stark reminder that while he was plotting a mystical escape, the physical threat of his world was ever present and deadly. A few days later, he met Alara in a secluded spot near the woods where the women washed the linens. The air was thick with the smell of lye soap and damp earth. He pressed the smooth, dark stone from Cato into her palm. Her fingers closed around it, her eyes questioning. Before he could speak, Cato himself emerged from the trees, as if summoned by their thoughts. He moved with a quiet purpose, his presence both comforting and unsettling. He gave Alara a bundle of gnarled, dark roots tied with a piece of twine. "Brew this into a tea," he told her, his gaze direct and meaningful. "It will make you sick for a day or two, just a summer fever. Happens all the time." It was not a suggestion, it was an instruction, a plan, a way to make her seem unwell, less fit for hard labor, and most importantly, less desirable for sale. It was a temporary shield, a small deception in a war of deception. Alara looked at the roots, then at Cato, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and understanding. She nodded, clutching the roots and the stone to her chest. Cato then turned his attention to Isaiah, and his voice dropped even lower. becoming a conspiratorial whisper that blended with the rustling leaves. The next full moon is a king tide. The ocean will be high, the earth will be full. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The well will be ready to receive a gift. This was it. The final, crucial piece of the puzzle. Not just a random night, but a specific, powerful alignment of natural forces. The ticking clock of Isaiah's plan suddenly grew deafeningly loud. The abstract hope, the secret study. It all coalesced into a single point in time. He felt a surge of gratitude so strong it almost buckled his knees, followed immediately by a wave of pure, cold terror. The path was no longer a dream. It was real, and it had a date. He looked at Alara, at her hand resting on her belly, and he knew there was no turning back. That night, the forge was a different place. Long after the plantation had fallen into a deep, exhausted slumber, Isaiah slipped back into the familiar twilight of his workshop. The great fire was banked, its heart reduced to a bed of pulsing red embers that cast a faint demonic glow on the walls. He moved with practiced silence, his bare feet making no sound on the packed earth floor. He was not working with Fairchild's precious Pennsylvania iron tonight. Over the months he had secreted away scraps, broken pieces, bits of metal he had found or traded for, hiding them in a hollowed-out log at the back of the forge. This was his own iron, his own secret supply. He carefully uncovered the shackles he was forced to wear every night, the heavy iron cuffs that connected his ankles with a short, thick chain. They were a cold, familiar weight, a constant reminder of his status. Using a pair of tongs, he held one of the central links over the dying embers, his hand steady, his focus absolute. He was not trying to melt it, only to heat it, to soften its temper, to introduce a weakness that would be invisible to the naked eye. Every tap of his small hammer was muffled, a dull thud absorbed by the night. He worked with the intense concentration of a surgeon, heating, tapping, and then allowing the link to cool slowly in the ash, preserving its color and texture. He examined his work in the low light, running his finger over the link. It looked solid, identical to the others, but he knew that with a sharp, specific twist, at just the right angle, it would break. It was a perilous, delicate act of sabotage. Then from a different piece of scrap, a hard sliver of steel, he began to forge something new. It was a small, sharp metal pick, no bigger than his finger, with a pointed tip and a flattened end he could grip. He heated and hammered it with the same silent intensity, quenching it in a hidden pot of oil to give it a brittle hardness. This was the key, the tool of his unmaking. As he worked, he thought of the feel of the chain, the cold bite of the iron against his skin, the way it restricted his stride, the constant galling weight he had carried for years. He was not just breaking a chain, he was dismantling a part of his own life, peeling away a layer of identity that had been forced upon him. The forge, so often the site of his enslavement, the place where he created the very tools of bondage, had become his workshop of freedom. The low red glow of the embers illuminated the sweat on his brow, the fierce, focused light in his eyes. This single, silent act of creation was the ultimate defiance, a microcosm of his entire impossible plan, using the master's tools and his own secret ingenuity to forge a new reality for himself. Link by broken link. The fragile hope Isaiah had forged in the secret heat of the embers was shattered by the mundane summons. A decorative iron gate on the great house porch had rusted through on its hinge, and he was called to repair it. The task was simple, but the location was a gilded cage, a place of suffocating beauty where the air was thin and every word spoken by the master could alter a life forever. As he worked, kneeling on the polished cypress floorboards of the veranda, he was rendered all but invisible, a piece of functional machinery. Master Fairchild was there, seated in a fine wicker chair, a glass of amber liquid sweating in his hand. With him was another man, a stranger with the hard, well-fed look of a trader, his boots polished to a high shine, his eyes constantly scanning, calculating. Isaiah kept his head down, his focus on the delicate work of fitting the repaired scrollwork back into place. But he listened. He had learned that survival on the Fairchild plantation depended as much on listening as on labor. "The cotton prices are not what they were," Fairchild was saying, his voice laced with a frustration that was close to a whine. He had the perpetual grievance of a man whose appetites outstripped his fortune. A bad run of cards, a few poor investments, and suddenly a man is stretched thin. The trader made a sympathetic noise that held no actual sympathy. "It is the way of things. Assets must sometimes be liquidated to shore up the foundation." He took a slow sip of his drink. "I am always in the market for new stock, of course. Heading down to the New Orleans market next month. The demand is insatiable." He paused. "A strong woman of breeding age can fetch a high price, or a prime blacksmith for that matter. A good one is worth his weight in silver." A cold dread, sharp and swift as a striking snake, coiled in Isaiah's gut. He felt his blood turn to ice water. He risked a glance from under his brow, his hands never ceasing their work. He saw Fairchild's gaze drift, his eyes becoming distant and transactional. The master's eyes swept past the fields, and then for a brief, terrible moment they landed on Isaiah himself, a flicker of cold assessment. Then his gaze moved on, sweeping across the lawn toward the distant laundry area, where the women worked in the hot sun, where Alara was. The look held no malice, which was somehow worse. It was the purely practical gaze of a farmer considering which livestock to sell to cover a debt. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The abstract, constant fear of being sold, of being separated from Alara, had suddenly become a concrete and immediate threat. The full moon, the king tide, the carefully constructed timeline of his escape, all of it was rendered meaningless. The future was no longer a distant shore he was navigating toward. It was a cliff edge, and Fairchild was about to push them all over. The iron of the gate felt slick with sweat under his hands. He gripped his tools so tightly his knuckles turned white, the hard reality of the metal a stark contrast to the dissolving certainty of his life. He finished the repair in a haze of controlled panic, his movements automatic. He bowed his head to the master, who dismissed him with an impatient wave, already deep in negotiations with the trader. Isaiah walked away from the great house, but he did not walk. He fled. He moved with a speed and purpose that was dangerously out of place for a slave, his long strides eating up the ground between the opulence of the master's world and the grim reality of his own. He had to get to Alara. He found her in their cabin, the setting sun casting long shadows through the door. He burst in, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his face a mask of terror. She looked up, her hands stilling, her eyes widening at the sight of him. All the quiet intimacy of their small home evaporated, replaced by a thick, palpable sense of crisis. "He's going to sell someone, Alara." Isaiah's voice was tight, strangled. The words tumbled out of him, a frantic torrent. "I heard him. A trader. He needs money. He looked at me and he looked toward the laundry. It could be you, it could be me, it could be both of us sent to different hells. We can't wait for the full moon. We can't wait." Alara stood up, her face pale. The roots from Cato were on the small table, a bundle of dark, gnarled potential. She looked from Isaiah's frantic eyes to the roots, and in that instant she understood. The terror was there. He could see it in the slight tremor of her hands, but beneath it was a bedrock of resolve that mirrored his own. She was not a woman who would shatter. She was a woman who would act. She walked to him and placed her hands on his chest as if to calm the frantic beating of his heart. Her touch was firm, grounding. "Then you go," she said, her voice low but clear, cutting through his panic. "Tonight." Ilara, I can't leave you, he began, the words tearing at him. You must, she insisted, her gaze unwavering. Her hand moved from his chest and rested on her belly, a silent, powerful reminder of the third life that bound them. He will not sell a sick woman, not for a high price. I will drink the tea tonight. Her decision was instant, absolute. You do what you have to do. Go. Be free for both of us, for all three of us. The sacrifice in her words was a physical blow. She would willingly make herself ill, risk punishment, risk the health of their unborn child, to give him this one chance. It was an act of love so profound it stole his breath. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, his face buried in her hair. It was a desperate, silent embrace that was both a hello to a future he couldn't see and a goodbye to the only life he had ever known with her. There were no tears. Their shared reality was too hard for the softness of weeping. There was only a shared, hardened resolve, a terrible and beautiful agreement. This was not his escape alone. It was their rebellion, and she was fighting her part of the battle with roots and deception, just as he would fight his with water and faith. As the sun began to touch the horizon, casting the world in a fiery, melancholic glow, Isaiah sought out Cato. He found him at the edge of the fields, looking west as if he had been waiting. The old man's face was a roadmap of wrinkles, and his eyes held a deep, ancient calm. Isaiah didn't need to speak. Cato knew. He could see the frantic energy radiating from the younger man, the desperate finality in his eyes. Cato looked at the setting sun, a great bleeding orb of orange and red. The tide waits for no man, he said, his voice a quiet rumble. But sometimes a man can't wait for the tide. He turned his gaze from the sky to Isaiah. The water knows your heart, Isaiah. It has felt your longing. It will be enough. From the pouch at his belt, Cato produced a small, tightly wrapped bundle of oilcloth. He pressed it into Isaiah's hand. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, containing the faint, earthy smell of dried herbs and something else, something ancient. This is from the before time, Cato explained, his voice dropping to a reverent whisper. It's a map for your soul, not your body. Hold it. Trust it. He leaned closer, his eyes locking with Isaiah's, imparting the final, terrifying instructions. You go down into the dark. When you reach the water, you do not stop. You hold your breath until you taste the salt. Do you hear me? Until you taste the salt. Don't be afraid of the dark. It's just the water's embrace. Isaiah nodded, his throat too tight for words. He could only clasp the old man's thin, wiry shoulder, a gesture of immense gratitude, a farewell to the only guide he had in this world. Cato patted his hand, a silent blessing, and then turned back to the sunset, his duty done. Isaiah was left standing with the weight of the charm in his hand, and the impossible instructions echoing in his soul. Night fell completely, a thick, starless blanket of humidity, and the chirping of insects. The plantation settled into its exhausted slumber. It was time. Isaiah walked toward the well, his movements deliberate, his heart a cold, heavy drum in his chest. He carried the water bucket, his final performance of the role he was about to shed forever. The air was still and every sound was magnified, the crunch of his own feet on the path, the distant bark of a dog, the creak of the well's winch. As he reached the well, a figure detached itself from the deeper shadows of the great house. Blevins. His presence was a jolt of pure adrenaline. The overseer was making his final rounds, his hand resting casually on the whip at his belt. "You're out late, blacksmith," Blevins called out, his voice laced with its usual suspicion. He walked closer, his boots silent on the soft earth, his pale eyes trying to pierce the darkness. Isaiah's entire being screamed at him to run, to fight, to do anything but stand there. But he forced himself to remain calm, his will a dam against the flood of panic. He began to turn the crank, the rope groaning in protest as the bucket descended into the blackness. His movements were steady, measured, the familiar rhythm of a nightly chore. "Mistress Fairchild wanted cool water for the night," he said, his voice astonishingly even. He did not look at Blevins, keeping his eyes on the rope spooling out into the abyss. Blevins stood there for a long, agonizing moment. The silence stretched, thick with tension. Isaiah could feel the man's gaze on his back, searching for any sign of deceit, any hint of the rebellion that was roaring in Isaiah's blood. He saw nothing but a slave doing his work. The scene was utterly ordinary. With a dissatisfied grunt, Blevins turned and moved on, his form melting back into the darkness from which it had come. Isaiah let out a slow, shaky breath. The lock had been released. The final guard had passed. The path was clear. He stood alone in the deep, dark quiet, the cool, damp air from the well rising to meet him. It smelled of wet earth, of moss, and tonight he imagined of freedom. The plantation was a beast that had fallen into a dead sleep, its breathing a low, humid drone of cicadas and frogs. In the deepest shadows behind the well, a space of profound blackness untouched by the distant, indifferent stars, Isaiah Green began the work of his own creation. The air was thick and still, holding the day's heat close to the ground. He pulled the small, sharp pick from the waistband of his trousers, the metal cool and solid against his trembling fingers. He knelt, his knees pressing into the damp earth, and felt for the familiar cold iron of his ankle shackles. His hands, guided by memory and a desperate prayer, found the central link, the one he had so carefully, so dangerously weakened in the dying embers of the forge. He inserted the hardened tip of the pick into the almost invisible seam he had created. This was the moment of truth, the point where all his secret labor, all his study and hope, would either succeed or fail catastrophically. He took a deep, ragged breath, the air tasting of moss and night-blooming jasmine. He held the pick steady with one hand and gripped the opposing link with the other. Then, with a sharp, violent twist of his entire body, he put all of his strength, all of his rage and longing, into the motion. The sound was shockingly loud in the absolute silence, a sharp metallic crack that seemed to echo across the entire plantation. It was the sound of a bone breaking, a sound of finality. For a heart-stopping second, Isaiah froze, certain that the sound had woken the dead, that Blevins would come running, that the dogs would begin to howl. But the night merely absorbed the sound, swallowing it into its vast, quiet belly. Nothing stirred. The beast slept on. A searing pain shot up his leg from where the metal had scraped his skin, but it was a clean, liberating pain, a pain he welcomed. He worked the broken link open and began to unwrap the heavy, clanking chains from his legs. The weight fell away, and the sensation was so alien that he nearly stumbled. For years the iron had been a part of him, a cold, heavy appendage that dictated the length of his stride, the speed of his movement, the very way he carried himself. Without it, he felt unnaturally light, untethered, as if he might float away. He stood slowly, his legs trembling not from fear but from a profound, disorienting sense of newness. He took a step, then another, his stride long and unimpeded for the first time since he was a boy. He felt the muscles in his legs free to move, to stretch, to run. He looked down at the chains coiled in his hands. They were no longer just iron. They were the physical manifestation of his stolen years, the weight of every humiliation, the cold embodiment of Fairchild's ownership. In the deep darkness, holding the instruments of his bondage, he felt a surge of pure, unadulterated rage, followed by a wave of wild, triumphant joy that was so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. But he did not cast the chains aside. He did not hurl them into the woods or bury them in the dirt. His plan, born of Cato's mysticism and his own methodical mind, required one final defiant act. He walked to the edge of the well, the heavy chains clanking softly in his hands. This was his message. This was his testament. He was not just a runaway slave, a fleeting ghost in the night. He was leaving a sign, a question that would echo long after he was gone, a mystery that would haunt the man who thought he owned him. He thought of Alara, safe in their cabin, her body fighting a feigned sickness for his sake. He thought of the new spirit, the unborn child who would one day hear this story, the story of the man who went to the well and gave it his chains in exchange for his freedom. With a deliberate, almost ritualistic motion, he lowered the broken shackles into the wooden water bucket that sat by the well's edge. The iron settled with a dull, heavy clank, a sound that was both an ending and a beginning. It was a final, ringing declaration of his rebellion, a calculated act of defiance that transformed his escape from a simple flight into a legendary act. He was seizing control of the narrative of his own disappearance, leaving behind a symbol that was both a curse on his captors and a promise to his people. Now there was only the final terrifying step. He clutched the small, oilcloth-wrapped bundle Cato had given him, its contents a mystery, its purpose an act of faith. He took one last look at the sleeping quarters, a collection of dark, silent shapes under the vast, dark sky. He sent a silent goodbye to Alara, a promise whispered to the soul of his child. Then he turned to the well. He swung his legs over the low brick wall, his bare feet finding the cold, damp stone. For months during his nightly chores he had studied this, memorizing the placement of the small, slick handholds and footholds used by the men who occasionally descended to clean the well. It was a map he had traced with his eyes, a path he had walked 1,000 times in his mind. He began to climb down, his body slipping over the edge and into the waiting blackness. The world above, the world of the plantation, of the sky and the trees, vanished. He was in a different realm now, a vertical tunnel of cold brick and absolute darkness. The air grew instantly colder, thick with the smell of wet earth, moss, and something deeper. The ancient mineral breath of the deep ground. The sounds of the night faded away, replaced by the soft scrape of his hands and feet against the bricks, the echo of his own ragged breathing, and the slow, steady drip, drip, drip of water from somewhere far below. His fingers, strong and calloused from a lifetime at the forge, found their holds. His toes, splayed for balance, pressed into the slick, uneven surfaces of the bricks. The descent was terrifying, claustrophobic. The darkness was not just an absence of light, it was a physical presence, a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed in on him from all sides. He was climbing down into the belly of the earth, guided only by the memory of a map and his faith in an old man's strange story. Every handhold was a prayer. Every foot placement was an act of will. He did not allow himself to think of the crushing blackness below or the impossible distance he was traveling. He focused only on the next hold, and the next, his world shrinking to the few inches of brick his hands could touch. After what felt like an eternity, his searching foot met not brick but the shocking, icy surface of water. He had reached the bottom. He paused, clinging to the wall. His legs submerged to his knees in the frigid pool. This was the point of no return. He took one last, huge, shuddering breath, filling his lungs until they burned, a breath of the air of the world he was leaving behind. He clutched Cato's bundle tightly in one hand, and then, with a final, desperate push, he let go of the wall and forced himself under the surface. The cold was a violent shock, stealing the warmth from his body in an instant. He swam down, kicking into the black, silent water, his eyes squeezed shut against the darkness. His lungs began to scream, a fiery agony that demanded release. Panic, cold and sharp, began to claw at the edges of his resolve. He was going to die here in the muddy bottom of a well, his last breath a bubble of air rising to a world that would never know. But just as the burning in his chest became unbearable, just as he was about to give in, to open his mouth and drown, he felt it. A current. It was unmistakable. The still, stagnant water of the well was moving. It was a gentle but firm pressure, a sideways pull that was utterly impossible. He was being drawn, pulled away from the vertical shaft of the well and into something else. He stopped fighting, stopped swimming, and allowed the current to take him. He was tumbling now, moving horizontally through an unseen passage, the pressure building in his ears. The darkness was total, absolute, a sensory deprivation so complete it was disorienting. He held on to the memory of Ilara's face, the image a single point of light in the crushing black. Then, driven by the desperate, instinctual need for air, he did what Cato had told him to do. He opened his mouth, expecting to inhale the foul, muddy taste of the well. Instead, his tongue was met with the clean, sharp, unmistakable taste of salt. Pure, undiluted salt. It was the taste of the harbor, the taste of the vast open ocean. A wave of shock and awe so powerful it momentarily erased his fear washed over him. Cato's story was true. The well drank from the sea. He was in a tunnel, a rushing subterranean river being carried swiftly through the heart of the earth. He had given himself over to the water completely. It was a baptism of violent and terrifying rebirth. The darkness was no longer an enemy, it was the water's embrace that Cato had promised. The journey felt timeless, a long tumbling passage through a world without light or sound. He saw flashes in his mind, images of his ancestors chained in the belly of a ship, crossing the great water against their will. But his journey was in reverse. He was not being brought to a land of bondage, he was being carried away from it, a return to the great cleansing source. He held his breath, his body screaming, and trusted the salt, the impossible, miraculous taste of freedom. The first light of dawn was a tender, pearlescent thing, spilling over the cypress trees and painting the undersides of the clouds in soft shades of rose and gray. It was the quietest time on the Fairchild plantation, a brief, cool respite before the sun rose in earnest and baked the world into submission. A young house girl, no more than 10 years old, made her way to the well, her bare feet silent on the dew-damp ground. It was her first chore of the day, every day, to fetch the cool, deep water for the master's morning ablutions. She worked the winch, her thin arms straining, her movements practiced and rhythmic. But this morning something was wrong. The bucket, usually a manageable weight, felt impossibly heavy, as if it had been filled with stones. She grunted, pulling with all her might, the rope groaning in protest, but the bucket barely moved. Confused and a little frightened of being late, she called out, her voice a small, reedy pipe in the vast quiet. "Help! I can't draw the bucket." Her call was answered by the last person she wanted to see. Mr. Blevins emerged from the direction of the stables, his face already set in a scowl. Annoyance radiated from him like heat from asphalt. "What's all this caterwauling?" he snapped, striding over to the well. "Get on with it, girl. The master's waiting." "I can't, Mr. Blevins," she whispered, shrinking back. "It's too heavy." Blevins let out a sigh of pure exasperation and shoved her aside. He grabbed the crank handle, intending to show her how it was done with a few powerful turns. He put his weight into it, and his eyes widened slightly in surprise. It was heavy. Cursing under his breath, he set his jaw and began to crank in earnest, the muscles in his forearms cording with the effort. The rope creaked and groaned, and slowly, inch by agonizing inch, the bucket began its ascent from the blackness. It broke the surface of the well's mouth, dripping, and the girl let out a sharp, piercing scream that shattered the morning peace. Blevins stared, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. The bucket was not filled with water. It was tangled with a heavy, coiled mass of iron. Shackles. Ankle cuffs and a length of thick chain, broken on one link, sat in the bucket, dripping water that seemed darker than it should be. They were covered in a strange, layered rust that looked both ancient and freshly formed, as if they had aged a century overnight. He reached out a trembling hand and touched one of the cuffs. It was cold, not with the simple cold of well water, but with a deep, profound chill that seemed to suck the warmth from his fingertips. The girl's scream had done its work. Lights appeared in the great house, and soon Master Fairchild himself was storming across the lawn, his nightshirt hastily tucked into his trousers, his face puffy with sleep and fury. What is the meaning of this? Who is screaming at this hour? He stopped dead when he saw the well, when he saw the bucket, when he saw the chains. His face, already florid, turned a deep, mottled purple. His mind, like Blevins's, leaped to the most obvious, most infuriating conclusion. "Isaiah!" he hissed, the name a curse on his lips. He pointed a trembling finger at the well. "He's in there. The fool killed himself, threw himself in the well like a worthless dog." The rage was absolute, but it was not the rage of grief. It was the fury of a man whose property had willfully destroyed itself, denying him his value. "Get him out!" he roared, his voice cracking. "Get him out of my well! I'll have his hide, dead or alive! I'll make an example of him!" The draining of the well became a grim public spectacle, a monument to Master Fairchild's impotent fury. He ordered every available hand to the task, pulling men from the fields, women from the laundry, creating a frantic bucket brigade of forced labor under the now scorching sun. The entire plantation was brought to a standstill, its daily rhythm broken by the master's obsession. Bucket after bucket of dark, cold water was hauled up and dumped onto the thirsty ground, forming a growing sea of mud around the well. Fairchild stood watching, his arms crossed, his face a thunderous mask, as if his sheer willpower could force the well to give up its dead. As the water level dropped, a strange and unfamiliar smell began to rise from the depths. It was not the expected smell of stagnant water, of mud and decay. It was a clean, sharp, briny scent that tickled the back of the throat and spoke of vast, open spaces. It was the unmistakable smell of the sea. The enslaved workers, their faces slick with sweat, exchanged nervous, questioning glances. They knew the smell of the harbor, but the harbor was miles away. For that smell to be rising from the heart of the plantation, from a freshwater well, was a thing that did not make sense, a crack in the known world. "What is that smell?" Fairchild demanded, his voice thick with disgust. He wrinkled his nose, offended by this new layer of defiance from the world he was supposed to command. Blevins, standing beside him, had no answer. He sniffed the air, his brow furrowed in confusion. It smelled like a lie. It smelled like something impossible. From the porch of her cabin, where she had been confined by her summer fever, Ilara watched the chaotic scene. She had dutifully drunk Cato's bitter tea, and the roots had done their work. A clammy sweat beaded on her skin. Her limbs felt weak, and a convincing pallor had settled on her face. She played her part perfectly, a mask of wan, pitiable grief fixed on her features for any who might look her way. But inside, her heart was a violent storm of terror and hope. When the first faint whispers of the salt smell reached her, carried on the humid breeze, she almost gasped. She knew that smell. It was the smell of Isaiah's words, of Cato's promise. It was the smell of a path no one could see. It was the smell of his success. A single hot tear escaped and traced a path through the dust on her cheek, a tear not of sorrow, but of a hope so fierce and terrifying it was almost painful. She could smell the ocean, and she understood. He had made it. He had walked the water road. The sun reached its zenith, beating down without mercy. The pile of mud grew, and the smell of salt became an undeniable presence, hanging thick and heavy in the air. The master's fury curdled into a sullen, baffled frustration. His power, his authority, his absolute ownership of the people and the land had failed against a simple smell. For the enslaved people hauling the buckets, their arms and backs screaming with the strain, the scent was a secret message. They watched their master's rage beat against the shores of a mystery he could not comprehend. And in the deepest, most hidden parts of their hearts, a new and dangerous seed of wonder began to take root. By late afternoon, the well was finally empty. The last bucket came up with a thick sucking sound filled with nothing but black, foul-smelling mud. The great spectacle had reached its climax. There was a tense, expectant silence. Fairchild, his face sunburned and grim, gestured with his chin. "Get down there," he ordered Blevins. "Find him." A heavy rope was tied around Blevins' waist, and he was lowered into the dark, circular maw of the well. He disappeared from sight, his curses echoing up the brick shaft as he slid through the mud at the bottom. The crowd waited, holding its breath. Ilara, still on her porch, pressed her hand to her mouth, her knuckles white. After a few long, tense moments, Blevins' voice, muffled and distorted, floated up from the depths. "He's not here. There's nothing here." He was hauled back up, covered in black mud and stinking of salt. He stumbled out of the harness, his face a mask of disbelief and frustration. "It's empty," he reported to Fairchild, shaking his head. "There's no body, no bones, no clothes, nothing, just mud." He paused. His brow furrowed as he tried to make sense of what he had seen. "There's a crack on the east side, a small fissure in the brickwork. The water, the smell, it seems to be seeping from there." He shook his head again as if to clear it. "But it's no bigger than my hand. A rat couldn't get through it, let alone a man. It makes no sense." Fairchild stared at him, his face a canvas of warring emotions, rage, confusion, and a dawning, terrifying sense of being mocked by a force he could not name. He refused to believe it. It was a trick. It had to be a trick. "He's out there," he snarled, spinning to face the assembled slaves, his voice raw with fury. "He's in the woods, he's on the roads, he's hiding." He raised his voice to a roar, a proclamation to the world. $100, $100 in silver for the man who finds him. I want him found." The hunt began, a frantic, useless exercise in power. Patrols were sent out, the woods were searched, the roads were watched. But it was a hunt for a ghost. Isaiah Green had vanished from the earth. The empty well, stinking of the distant sea, was a gaping hole in Fairchild's authority, a silent, mocking testament to his failure. The mystery of the disappearance was 1,000 times more infuriating, more corrosive to his power than a simple, understandable escape would have been. He had been left with a question that had no answer, and it began to eat at him, a poison for which there was no antidote. That night, a different kind of story was being told in the quarters. The frantic energy of the hunt, the master's rage, the barking of the dogs, all of it felt distant, part of a different, less important world. Here, in the close, dark spaces of the cabins, the mood was not one of fear, but of profound and trembling awe. They spoke in hushed whispers, the words passed from person to person like a sacred text. They spoke of the chains in the bucket, a final, defiant offering. They spoke of the impossible smell of salt, a sign from a world beyond their own. One of the elders, a woman whose memory stretched back decades, looked toward the filled-in darkness where the well had been and nodded slowly. "The water took him," she whispered, her voice filled with a certainty that transcended logic. "It heard his sorrow, and it took him home." In the corner, old man Cato sat on his stool, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. He said nothing, merely listened to the story taking root, a story he had helped to plant. His eyes found Ilara's across the crowded room, and for a brief instant a shared, secret understanding passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the miracle they had witnessed. Later, Alone in the suffocating darkness of her own cabin, Alara lay on her pallet, the feigned sickness having given way to a deep, soul-shaking exhaustion. She held the smooth, cool stone that Isaiah had given her, the one Cato had blessed. It was a solid, real thing in a world that had dissolved into legend. The air coming through the window still carried the faint, clean scent of the ocean, a perfume of impossible distance. She clutched the stone to her chest, a piece of the land he had left behind, and whispered his name into the darkness. It was not a cry of sorrow or loss. It was a whisper of reverence, of awe, of a love so powerful it had bent the rules of the world. Isaiah Green was gone, but in his place a story had been born, a story that said a man could give his chains to the water and walk away free. It was a story that said the world was bigger, more magical, and more filled with hope than their masters could ever comprehend. And that story, she knew, would never be captured. A decade is a lifetime. On the Fairchild plantation, it was an eternity of slow, inexorable decay. The vibrant greens of the fields had faded, choked by weeds and neglect. Fences sagged, paint peeled from the great house like sunburnt skin, and a pervasive silence had replaced the rhythmic sounds of labor. The ruin had started not with a fire or a storm, but with a mystery. It began with a lingering, impossible smell of salt and an empty well. Master Fairchild, now a man stooped and hollowed out by the intervening years, had lost a fortune hunting for a ghost. The $100 reward had ballooned into 1,000, then into a small fortune poured into the pockets of bounty hunters, trackers, and charlatans who brought him nothing but false leads and whispered rumors. He had become a man obsessed, his authority crumbling with his finances as he chased a phantom he could never catch. The disappearance of one man, a single blacksmith, had done more to ruin him than any open rebellion. A rebellion he could have understood, could have crushed with satisfying brutality. But this was different. It was a quiet, insidious mockery of his power, a riddle that had eaten him from the inside out. The well had been filled in years ago, a scar of packed earth and struggling weeds that Fairchild avoided with a superstitious dread. He spent most of his days now on the veranda, a glass of whiskey perpetually in his hand, his eyes vacant. Sometimes, when the wind blew just right from the east, he would lift his head and sniff the air, his mind playing tricks on him. He thought he could still smell the salt. The scent was a torment, a reminder of the day his absolute power had met a force it could not comprehend. It was the smell of his own undoing. He had lost more than a valuable slave and a significant portion of his wealth. He had lost the bedrock of his world, the unshakable certainty that he was the master of his domain, that the laws of nature and man bent to his will. Isaiah Green had not just escaped, he had punctured reality, leaving Fairchild to bleed out in a world that no longer made sense. Far away, in a city of brick and cobblestone, the air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of coal smoke and baking bread, not jasmine and swamp mud. In a small, neat house in a free black community in Philadelphia, a different kind of legacy was being tended. Here Alara lived, her face lined with the memory of hardship but illuminated by a quiet, resilient strength. She had eventually found her own path to freedom, a harrowing journey on the Underground Railroad years after Isaiah's disappearance, her flight made possible by the chaos and decline that had consumed the Fairchild plantation. Her son Isaac, a bright-eyed boy of 9 with his father's strong hands and his mother's gentle spirit, sat at her feet, his chin resting on his knees, captivated. She was telling him a story, the story she had carried in her heart like a sacred ember across hundreds of miles. It was not a story of whips and chains, but of water and magic. "And they never found him?" Isaac asked, his voice a whisper of awe. It was his favorite part of the story, the part that never changed, the part that always filled him with a sense of wonder. Ilara smiled, a slow, beautiful smile that seemed to smooth the lines of worry from her face. She reached out and gently brushed a stray curl from his forehead. "No, child," she said, her voice soft as worn velvet. "You can't find a man who walks on water. The world of the master is small and built on things he can see and touch. Your father, he stepped into a bigger world." She leaned forward, her eyes shining. "He gave his chains to the well as an offering. And the water, it remembered the way home. It carried him through the dark earth to the sea, and the sea washed him clean and made him free." She opened a small wooden box on the table beside her and took out a single smooth, dark stone. It was cool to the touch, its surface worn to a perfect polish by the passage of time and the touch of loving hands. She pressed it into Isaac's palm. "This is from him," she said. "Cato gave it to your father, and I have kept it for you. It's a piece of the land he left behind, but his spirit is in the ocean. Every time you see a river, every time you hear the rain, you are hearing a piece of his journey." Isaac closed his fingers around the stone. It felt solid, real, a tangible link to the father who was both a man and a myth. The story was not a secret whispered in fear anymore. It was a proud banner of their heritage, a testament to a miraculous freedom that defied explanation. Ilara was not a figure of tragedy, a woman left behind. She was a survivor, a griot, the keeper of a sacred flame. The contrast between her new life of quiet dignity in this small, safe house and the brutal, decaying world of the plantation was absolute. Here, the story of Isaiah Green was not a haunting mystery, but a lullaby of hope. The coastline was a rugged, windswept place where the land met the sea in a dramatic tumble of gray rock and hardy, salt-stunted pines. The water was a deep, churning blue-green capped with white foam, and the air was so clean and sharp it felt like a tonic in the lungs. The time was ambiguous, the place a mystery. It could have been Nova Scotia, it could have been the coast of Africa, it could have been England. It was simply elsewhere. Here by the sea lived a man. He was older now, his hair and beard shot through with gray, his face a handsome weathered map of years spent in the sun and wind. We would recognize him as Isaiah. He was a boat builder, his workshop a large airy shed that smelled of sawdust and tar and the ever-present salt of the sea. His hands, still powerful and calloused, moved with a familiar, confident grace, shaping the wood not with force but with an intimate understanding of its nature. He was a respected man in the small fishing village he called home. He had a wife, children, and even grandchildren who climbed on his knee and listened to his stories, stories of the sea, of the creatures in its depths, of the stars that guided sailors home. He never spoke of the forge or the heat or the weight of chains. That was a life that belonged to a different man in a different world. This evening, as was his custom, he walked along the shore as the sun began to set. The beach was not sand, but a collection of smooth gray stones and the tangled sea-bleached skeletons of driftwood. He bent down and picked up a piece of wood, its surface worn smooth by the endless caress of the waves. He turned it over in his hands, his thumbs feeling the texture, the grain, the history of its journey. He looked out at the vast, endless ocean, a shimmering expanse of silver and gold under the setting sun. It stretched to the horizon, meeting the sky in a seamless, infinite line. He walked to the water's edge, the waves hissing and sighing as they slid over the stones at his feet. He crouched down, dipped his hand into the surf, and brought the water to his lips. He tasted it. It was salty, clean and sharp and deeply, wonderfully salty. A slow smile spread across his face, a smile of peace, of memory, of profound and settled contentment. We do not need to know the details of his impossible journey, for to explain the magic would be to diminish it. The how did not matter. The that was everything. He was here. He was free. The image was one of perfect, powerful peace. He was a man defined not by the iron he had once worn, but by the great cleansing water that had set him free. The camera of our mind pulls back and back, showing him as a small, solitary figure against the immense, breathtaking backdrop of the sea and the sky. He had survived. He had endured. He had become a part of the water's eternal, mysterious, and liberating story.